So let's start with Lab4, and we have to define the connection string in the web config file so that the business context can be accessed within the MVC, as only the application context can be accessed within it by default. And that's done here, as you can see. Now if we look at the class library in the models folder, you can see we've added a student and course entity. All the other classes came from week3, and the DTOs are data transfer objects, and they could have been kept locally inside the configuration file, but I just put them into this folder as well. And we need to add some using statements to the top of these two classes to deal with the keys and the displays and the list. If we go to the club context file, you can see where we added the DB set for the student and courses entities, and these CS files in the models folder represent an entity in the database, so we have to have a DB set for each one except for the DBOs, of course. If we right click on the club's context, go to entity framework and view entity data model, we can generate an entity data model using the extension Power Tools for Entity Framework 6, and I have it saved up here, and you can see the relationships between all the entities. So in our class library we have two files that we want to take our data from, and the data in these files is comma separated, so we have to install a package called CSV helper to read the data in from these Excel files. And you can see here I have the CSV helper package installed. So to get this data we have two methods that return lists, get underscore courses and get underscore students. These methods call the generic list method that returns a list. All you have to do is pass in the type or model that you want the data to be structured in and pass in the path of the resources. The generic list method then gets the current assembly of the executable project and creates a string path based on the string path passed to it. And we'll use the CSV helper to get a batch of records, put these in a list, and return this list to the column method. Course and student lists are both populated in this way, and they just pass in different paths for the resources and different DTOs. We can then loop through each record in each list and set our object property to whichever corresponding record property, and then change data types or trim parts of the data if we wish, like we did here. It's important to remember that if we go to the properties of an CSV file, we have to make sure that the build action is embedded resource and the copy to output directory is on copy always, or else it won't work. So next we have to seed the club, and we just provide data for each club property and then do inline seeding for the club events as well. Next we assign a random set of students as members of a club. Initially I'd manually added these students, but whenever you read the brief and seen that it had to be random, I implemented this method. This method loops through all the clubs in the clubs table, creates a list of all the student IDs, assigning each one to a GUID, which is guaranteed to be random and unique. We order these, take 10 of these, and add these to a list called selected students. These students are added as members of the club and for the current iteration and before each loop, looping through the clubs, so in this case either club 1, 2, or 3. The order in which we seed the data is very important, as some entities are dependent on others. First I seeded the students and courses, and then the clubs, then student members of the clubs, and then the event attendance last. To ensure all the tables go in the same database, I had to ensure that the connection string was the same as the connection string in the app.config file, and the application DB context constructor, and the club's context constructor, and the web config file. Now, in the configuration file of the MVC, we create variables for the user manager and the role manager. We add 3 roles in the roles table. We then seed 2 members, give one the role of full admin and one the role of a normal user. And then if we go to our shared folder and our login partial view, we check that the user is authenticated in an admin role, and we only display a link to maintain the clubs if they hold both of these, so they are authenticated and they have an admin role. And this could be done in the layout view too, but it doesn't really make a difference, so I've just called this login partial, like because I've done it in the login partial, it's called there, and it checks in the login partial. And I'll just very quickly show you all the data in all the tables. So if we run the app, we can see that the link for maintaining the clubs isn't there if we're not logged in. But if we log in as Paul. He's the role of admin, so he gets this action link for maintaining the club, which doesn't have anything in it at the moment. So moving on to lab 6, first you have to make sure that the connection strings are all the same in the web config and the app config. For then in the class, by having role-based authorization. So moving on to lab 7, I added a model view class called clubviewModel.ts, and this will be used as a model later for the creation of a view, and they act like a model. They act as a model schema type thing for the data to follow, for the structure of the data. I then added a club admin controller with reference to the user manager in the club context, and I marked the controller with an authorize again, this time with both the roles of admin and club admin. And again, I added a if statement in the layout view to only show the link to the controller if the user is in one of the specified roles. And we can check the roles again with the SQL query for the roles. And if we run it, there you can see the results at the bottom there. So I had to delete the index view that was initially in the club controller view folder and remade it this time using a details template with the business context from the class library as context. So that's that index view that we created. And we had to create an index action that populates a list of clubs based on where the admin ID of the club matches the ID of the current user, if there is a match at all. Otherwise, it'll tell the user that they either have no roles to maintain, no clubs to maintain, or that they don't have the correct role to manage any clubs. I then changed the index view that it would display a list of clubs and their creation date with some headers above, and button was an embedded action view that would pass in the club ID of the club that the club admin is authorized to administrate based on the admin ID and member ID match. We then created a new controller action called approve on the controller, which takes in the club ID passed in from the index view and finds the club associated with this ID and maps all the properties in the maintain club view model we created earlier. This model is returned as a view to the user, and I had to right click on the controller action approve and generate a view using the meta template with no data context. Here you can see it, and then you can see where I've added two tables, one for revoking membership and one for approving membership, and one looks through the approved members and one looks through the unapproved members in the newly populated maintain club view model. And then we then added a HTTP post action result called approve, which relayed approvals and revokes back to the database and to the browser. And for Lab 8, we had to add a new DB set for the club events and a navigation property in the clubs class to the club events class. Because these actions make changes to the context and the database structure, we needed to add a new migration update to the database to see these changes take effect. Next, in the configuration.cs file in the class library, we had to add 3 clubs, create inline events for each of the clubs. We then had to create a new controller in the MVC called club events, a controller action called all club details, and an associated empty view, which means that it has no template or model class. This view will display all the club events for each club in the table and add an action link in the nav bar to the club events controller. It has a search box and a button to refine the table contents to an individual club. Next, we had to create a partial view with the list template, and we just add a reference to the partial view from the index view, and you can see we did that there.